Good afternoon. Welcome to Folk and Fairy Tales. I'm Miss Debbie from the Morton Grove Public Library, and I have two stories to share with you today. This is a little bit different. Right now, we have 11 folk and fairy tales that are on Facebook Live and on YouTube. And if you're a teacher, you can look at Morton Grove Public Library, YouTube, folk and fairy tales, whatever, however you want to find it. And there'll be a list of 11 different Facebook Live story times. And 10 of them are fairy tales that teachers have asked me to read to their classes. The last one that I did, The Princess and the Pea, I actually was asked not to read it in a classroom, but I thought I would put it online in case someone else wanted it. This will be my last time to do Facebook Live as far as I know. Who knows how things are going to go. So I thought I would do something a little different. I have two fairy tales. One is the Frog Prince and the other is Rumpelstiltskin. And it's a little bit hard in these two fairy tales to find out who is good and who is bad. And it is interesting in both of them, they don't say, and they all lived happily ever after. Let's find out why. So we do know there's some magic elements to both of them. There is it's kind of a long time ago, once upon a time thing. There are events in threes, 3 days, 3 nights, things like that. There is certainly a problem and a conflict that needs to be resolved. And there may be a lesson that needs to be learned. So let's start our first story. Okay, I'm going to show you this book. I'll put these in the list. This is The Frog Prince by Galdone. I'm not going to read this particular one, but it is published by McGraw-Hill Books. I'm going to read the McElderry book of Grimm's Fairy Tales by Saviour Pirotta, and it is published by Margaret K. McElderry Books. Now this one kind of gives away who they think the bad person is. They have titled it The Naughty Princess and the Frog, the story of the Frog Prince. Long ago, when wishing could still make dreams come true, there was a king who had many daughters. They were all pretty, but the youngest was so beautiful she even dazzled the sun. Sometimes when the weather was warm, the princess went out to the forest and sat by a cool, deep well. One day she was playing with her favorite ball when all of a sudden it slipped out of her hands and sank into the water. The princess tried to fish it out, but it was no use. The well was too deep. "Oh dear," said the beautiful princess, and she started to wail and cry. "Whatever is the matter?" croaked a voice behind her, and the prince turned to see a huge frog with a wrinkled neck and bulging eyes. "I have dropped my favorite ball in the well," she sniffed. "I'll give anything to have it back." And I'll show you this picture. Of course, he was not wearing a crown. And look what he has. "Simply anything," repeated the princess. I'll give my clothes, my jewels, even my precious crown. It has 12 diamonds in it. I have no use for crowns or jewels, said the frog, but if you promise to let me come and live with you in your palace, if you will let me eat from your golden plate and sleep on your silken pillow, I'll fetch your ball for you. What a fool this frog is, thought the princess. Frogs can only survive near ponds and wells. They can't live with people in houses or palaces. So she smiled and promised the frog she would take him to the palace with her if he retrieved her ball. And of course he did. He dived into the bottom of the well, and a minute or two later, he surfaced with the golden ball in his mouth. Thank you, said the princess. And she reached and took the ball and started running away. He said, Wait for me. Don't you remember your promise? But she took no heed of his words. The next day, the princess was having dinner, and her father heard something come creeping up the marble steps. Plip, plop, plip, plop, plip. When he reached, there was a knock at the door, and a croaky voice said, Princess, princess, let me in. Must be one of your friends, said the father. Go open the door. It was the frog. Oh, and she told her father all about the golden ball and the promise she had made the frog. The frog said, Youngest daughter of the king, open up and let me in. Don't you know that yesterday you said to me down near the well, Youngest daughter of the king, open up and keep your word. So the father looked at his daughter and said, You must keep your promises. So I will just tell this part of the story. She picked him up, she put him at the table, and he began to eat off of her plate. What would you think of having a frog sitting on your table, eating out of your plate that you were eating out of? Well, she didn't like it very much. And then afterwards, he asked to go with her to his room. And he didn't want to just have a little, place in a box or a terrarium like you would another pet frog. He wanted to sleep on her pillow. Oh my goodness. She was horrified. Don't be impertinent, she cried. And then he asked, Will you kiss me? Oh, that was the worst thing of all. And so you know what she did? In this version, she picks him up and she throws him against the wall. And when she does, he turns into a prince. And once she sees that he's a prince, they decide to get married. And they lived happily ever after. Or did they? This story can end several different ways. In one, the father says, Keep your promise. And she does. And so for 3 nights, she lets the frog sleep on her silken pillow. And then, voila, he becomes a prince. And then the version I just read to you, she throws him against the wall and he becomes a prince. And what the version most of us are familiar with is she kisses him and he becomes a prince. Now, I wonder, who is the good guy and the bad guy in this story? They call her the naughty princess because she didn't want to keep her promises. But really, Was that a reasonable thing for a frog to want to eat off of her plate? Couldn't he have had his own plate? Couldn't he have had his own little bed? No, he wanted to sleep in her bed. And was it fair for the father to make her keep that kind of promise? Maybe, maybe not. Why was the prince turned into a frog to begin with? Was he cruel and selfish like Beast in Beauty and the Beast, and an enchantress changed him to teach him a lesson? We don't know. Most of the stories say that it's a wicked witch that changes him. And you get the feeling that he might be kind of a nice guy because he has a really good manservant named Henry, who is so happy to have his master back. And really, it's a happy ending for him. But I don't know. They might have some struggles if you have a princess that won't keep her promises and a prince who may ask a little bit too much. There's another way that this story can end, and this is what Disney did in their story. They had the princess and the frog. Tiana kisses the frog, and she turns into a frog. Oh my goodness. And in this one, it is the prince who is irresponsible and lazy, and he learns a lesson. So I think in this story, they might actually live happily ever after. Okay, our next story. Before we do our next story, let's get the wiggles out, okay? My fingers are starting to wiggle, my fingers are starting to wiggle, my fingers are starting to wiggle, wiggle all around. My elbows are starting to wiggle, my elbows are starting to wiggle, my elbows are starting to wiggle. Wiggle all around. My shoulders are starting to wiggle. My shoulders are starting to wiggle. My shoulders are starting to wiggle. Wiggle all around. My head is starting to wiggle. My head is starting to wiggle. My head is starting to wiggle. I guess we better sit down. Wiggling all over. Stretch. All right. The next story is Rumpelstiltskin. This story always kind of bothered me. This is another version by Paul Galdone, and it is published by Clarion Books. And once again, I'm not going to read every word. There we go. Once upon a time, there was a poor miller whose only treasure was his beautiful daughter. Now it happened that the miller had to go on an errand to the king. The miller wanted to make himself appear important, so he said, "I have a daughter who can spin straw into gold." "That is a marvelous art," replied the king. "If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her to my palace tomorrow, and I will put her to the test." When the king said that, the miller regretted his boast, but he knew he must obey the king's demand. As soon as the miller's daughter arrived at the palace, the king took her into a room filled with straw. He gave her a spinning wheel and some bobbins and said, "Now set to work, and by dawn tomorrow, if you have not spun this straw into gold, you will die." He locked the door and left the miller's daughter alone in the room, and she sat because she had no idea how to spin straw into gold. And as the hours passed, she grew more and more frightened and at last she began to weep. Here's where I'm going to speed up the story a little bit. Along came a funny little man. "Good evening," he said. "Why are you crying so?" "Alas, I have to spin straw into gold, and I do not know how to do it." "What will you give me if I do it for you?" "My necklace," said the girl. The little man took the necklace and seated himself in front of the wheel. Whirl, whirl, whirl it went, and in three turns the bobbin was full. Whirl, whirl, whirl. A second bobbin, until he had turned all the straw into gold, and he slipped out the door. Of course, the king was delighted, but instead of being satisfied, he put her in another room with even more straw and told her the same thing. "You must spin this straw into gold by tomorrow if you value your life." And of course, there was the funny little man, and this time she gave him her ring. Those were the only two things of value that she had. And by morning he had spun the straw into glorious gold. The king rejoiced at the sight, but he was still not satisfied. So on the third day he said, "You must spin this too in the course of a night, and if you succeed, you shall be my wife." As he locked the door, he thought, "She may only be a miller's daughter, but I am sure I could not find a ring to give." So when the funny little man asked her what she would give him, she said she had nothing. And he says, "Then promise me, if you should become queen, to give me your first child." And she thought, who knows if this will ever happen? So not knowing how else to help herself, she promised to give the little man what he wanted. And grinning, he sat down at the wheel and once more spun the straw into gold. The king came in the morning, saw all the gold, and arranged a grand wedding. And the miller's daughter became the queen. And in time, they had a beautiful daughter. She was so happy with the child that she never once thought about the little man. But one day he suddenly appeared in her room. "Now, give me what you have promised." The queen began to cry, and the little man took pity on her and said, "I will give you 3 days," he said. "If by the end of that time you find out my name, you shall keep your child." So she stayed up all night thinking of names, and when the little man came, she began with Caspar, Melchior, and Belteshazzar, and she said all the names that she knew. And he said, "No, that is not my name." On the second day, she learned the names of everyone living near the palace. "Perhaps your name is Short Ribs, or Sheepshanks, or Laceleg." But the little man always answered, "No, that is not my name." On the third day, she sent a messenger out to find more names. And he told her, "I was not able to find a single new name, but as I approached a high mountain at the end of the forest, I saw a little house, and before me a fire was burning, and round about the fire a little man was jumping. He hopped first on one leg and then on the other and shouted, 'Today I brew, tomorrow I bake, the next day the young queen's child I take. Soon far and wide will spread the fame that Rumpelstiltskin is my name.'" How glad the queen was when she heard the messenger. Soon afterward, the little man came in and said, "Now, Queen, what is my name?" At first she said, "Conrad?" "No." "Is it Harry?" "No." "Then perhaps your name is Rumpelstiltskin." "The devil told you that! The devil told you that!" cried the little man. And in his rage he stamped his right foot on the ground so hard that he sank to his waist. Then he stamped his left foot so hard he disappeared from sight. The earth fell on top of him, and Rumpelstiltskin was never seen again. The end. So, there was no Rumpelstiltskin to take her child, and the queen had a beautiful daughter that she loved very much. But was she going to live happily ever after? I don't know. She married a very selfish and greedy king. He threatened to kill her if she did not spin straw into gold. What do you think about that? Would that be a happily ever after? I don't think so. Neither did Diane Stanley. She wrote a book called Rumpelstiltskin's Daughter. And the book starts out saying the father boasts that his daughter can spin straw into gold, which was maybe not evil, but a very foolish thing to do. And here we have a different picture of what the miller's daughter looks like. And there's the king. There's the room full of straw and the spinning wheel. And the same threat. Except this time, the little man is not an ugly little man. Actually, he's kind of cute. She gives him her necklace. She gives him her ring. And then on the third night, she, of course, has nothing to give. And he says to her, "Okay, here's the deal. I will spin the straw into gold just like before. In return, once you become queen, you must let me adopt your firstborn child. I promise I'll be an excellent father. I know all the lullabies. I'll read to the child every day. I'll even coach Little League." "You've got to be kidding, Meredith," the miller's daughter said. "I'd rather marry you than that jerk." So this is where the story changes. Instead of marrying the king, she marries Rumpelstiltskin. He saved her life 2 times already, and he likes kids. But that's not the end of this story. They get married. They live a quiet, peaceful, simple life out in the country, and they have a daughter. And here she is at 16 years old. And every once in a while, Rumpelstiltskin will spin straw into gold so that they can do something special. And their daughter takes it to town and buys things with it. Well, word got around that this girl was coming to town with spools of gold. And guess who found out about it? The king. So he has his guards get Rumpelstiltskin's daughter and bring her to the palace. But this time, she outsmarts him. And that's where I'm going to end this story. She not only saves herself, she saves the people of the kingdom from such a cruel, greedy king. And in the process, he learns a lesson and finds out that he can be much, much happier than what he was before. Before he was never, never satisfied. And by the way, Rumpelstiltskin's daughter is named Hope. So we can always hope. And this story actually does have a happily ever after. Are there stories that you've heard before and maybe something just doesn't seem quite right about them? And you might want to change them. It's okay. It's a fairy tale. It's a folk tale. People have been changing these for centuries. And you can do that too if you use your imagination. And then maybe you will have a happily ever after. That's all for today. Bye-bye. Mwah.